And now our opening hymn. Please stand as you are able or willing. It's number 25 in the gray hymnal. It's God of the earth, the sky, the sea. Hymn number 25.
I'll turn on the mic so you can all hear me. What a pleasure to be with you this morning. So today's wisdom story is going to introduce us to this theme of Unitarian ancestors. And I'm going to share a little bit, and then I just want to prepare you. So what I'm going to prepare you for will fill some of you with excitement and might fill some of you with some anxious anticipation, but I am going to ask us to engage in some conversation with one another in the sanctuary and for folks online in the chat about what I'd like to share, just to prepare you. So the history of our church, the Unitarian Universalist Church, is rooted in two Christian denominations, the Unitarians and the Universalists. And in 1961, the two denominations merged into a single one, the one that we align with today, the Unitarian Universalist Association. And this merger was possible because people in these churches and their ministers shared common ideas about the sacred. In other words, there was shared theology. In the 19th century, both the Unitarians and Universalists established themselves as formal denominations, that challenged the era's orthodox Protestant Christian theology, thus introducing that term liberal religion. In today's service, we won't be looking at the whole of that history. We're going to hone in on some of our Unitarian ancestors, two of them, in fact, who challenged prevailing ideas of God and the sacred. We'll examine the beliefs of the Reverend William Ellery Channing and the Reverend John Dietrich. Channing was preaching in the 1820s and Dietrich in the 1920s. Channing is best known for his work establishing Unitarianism as a distinct sect or denomination, and Dietrich might be best remembered for establishing humanism as a strand in Unitarianism. So for this wisdom story moment, we'll turn our attention first to the liberal ideas of Channing, preached in the early 20th century. William Ellery Channing was a young minister at the Federal Street Church in Boston, now Arlington Street Church. And he was a privileged white man who studied at Harvard, the child of a prominent lawyer in Newport, Rhode Island. He was named for his maternal grandfather, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. In 1819, he traveled to Baltimore, Maryland, to deliver a sermon titled Unitarian Christianity. It was the first public assertion that gave a name and outlined a set of beliefs about Christianity that had been gaining traction for the last 20 years among New England ministers in their pulpits and seminaries. Historian John Burns describes Channing's style of preaching as magnetic and luminous. Likely, his sermon in Baltimore captivated the audience with lines such as the ones printed in the handout in your order of service. Indeed, his sermon lasted for over 1 hour. It was reprinted and shared and really made an impact on the formation of the American Unitarian Association later that decade, and on the development of ministers in what came to be known as our Unitarian tradition. So I'll read aloud some statements from Channing's Baltimore address, and given the historical nature of today's service, I retain Channing's gendered language to refer to humankind and to God. First excerpt. Our leading principle in interpreting Scripture is this, that the Bible is a book written for men, in the language of men, and that its meaning is to be sought in the same manner as that of other books. We profess not to know a book which demands a more frequent exercise of reason than the Bible. Second excerpt. We believe in the doctrine of God's unity, of that there is one God and one only. To us, as to the apostles and the primitive Christians, there is one God, even the Father. We, like Jesus, we worship the Father as the only living and true God. Third excerpt, this one on the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity is unfavorable to devotion by dividing and distracting the mind in its communion with God. The excellence of the doctrine of God's unity is that it offers us one object of supreme homage, adoration, and love. Final excerpt. We venerate not the loftiness of God's throne, but the equity and goodness in which it is established. We believe that God is infinitely good, kind, benevolent, good to every individual as well as the general system. These ideas were new in 1819. Reading the Bible as a text open to criticism based on reason, rejecting the doctrine of the Trinity affirmed in the Nicene and Apostles' Creed. The idea of humans made in the image of God, not born into depravity, could well have been alarming and illuminating to those gathered. Innovative theological ideas, just like the steam locomotive and the tin can, consequential innovations of that era of the Industrial Revolution, similar to innovative political ideas of the time, bending the arc of justice towards an end to slavery, Denmark Vesey's revolts, and the Missouri Compromise. So I'd like us to reflect on these once new theological ideas. 1819, that's about 200 years ago. So I have two questions for you. First question, how do Channing's assertions of Unitarian Christianity relate to your own beliefs about the sacred? Second question, how do you typically respond to new ideas? How would it feel for an unfamiliar minister to come to your church and give language to a new idea? So let's reflect on those in conversation, if you're comfortable doing so. In a moment, online in the chat box, or in person by finding a partner or a trio, I'd like you to reflect on those two questions, and I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes, and I'll call you back when it's time to regather. Just take those next 15, 20 seconds to thank your partner, offer some gratitude in the chat, and then we'll hear a musical offering by Lauren Evans.
Hello, it's time to come back. Stop enjoying each other. Thank you.
Seek deeper still within your souls and sense the wonder there. The ceaseless thrust to noble goals of life, more free and fair. Ye earthbound children of a star, who seek and long and strive, take humble pride in what you are. Be glad to be alive.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Today's reading is entitled, They Are With Us Still. It was written by Kathleen McTeague. And the struggles we choose for ourselves and the ways we move forward in our lives and bring our world forward with us, it is right to remember the names of those who gave us strength in the choice of living. It is right to name the power of hard lives well lived. We share a history with those lives. We belong to the same motions. They too were strengthened by what had gone before. They too were drawn on by the vision of what might come to be. Those who lived before us, who struggled for justice and suffered injustices before us, have not melted into the dust and have not disappeared. They are still with us. The lives they lived hold us steady. Their words remind us and call us back to ourselves. Their courage and love invoke our own. We, the living, carry them with us. We are their voices, their hands, and their hearts. We take them with us, and with them choose the deeper path of living. May it be so.
I hope you enjoyed your conversations, if you chose to have one. As Reverend Althea mentioned in introducing me, I came into Unitarian Universalism in my early 20s. And being someone who came into the faith, I really was hungry to understand what exactly is it that we do, and where do these unique ideas like our 7 principles come from? How is it that we are a religion, and what is our history? And ever since then, I've been asking those questions, and I feel like every year I'm uncovering new answers. And while I was in seminary, I got to study the work of William Ellery Channing and John Dietrich, and it inspired me to share some of their writing in the form of a sermon, because we remain connected to Channing's interpretation of Christian scripture in so many ways, including through our 7 principles. When we affirm that all people are worthy of dignity and respect, we're echoing the theology of Channing, who declared that no one is born depraved we are connected to Channing, especially worshiping today in this parish, because Channing influenced those around him, including Concord resident Ralph Waldo Emerson, a contemporary of his. His Baltimore address preceded the formation of the denomination that merged to become the Unitarian Universalist Association. And Channing influenced the ministers who came after him, and that's where we get to turn our attention to Reverend John Dietrich. In 1917, about 100 years after Channing preached the Unitarian Christianity sermon, the Reverend John Dietrich started a conversation about theology with the Reverend Curtis Reese. So in 1917, politically at the time, women's suffrage was underway. Organizing among African Americans was growing with the founding of the NAACP in 1909. And industrialization continued. New inventions in that decade included electric refrigeration, airplanes, and motor cars. All less than 10 years old when these two ministers compared their beliefs. This conversation also happened in the context of the third year of the Great War, World War I. An important theological question of that time was, how could a loving God allow the massive scale of suffering to occur? Dietrich and Reese both came into Unitarianism from other Christian denominations. Dietrich was raised in rural Pennsylvania in a family of German and Swiss descent, and first became a minister in the Reformed Protestant Church. He left when his liberal theology was no longer a fit. These two ministers were more liberal than many of their Unitarian peers in the early 20th century. Why? Well, because they rejected any supernatural aspects of Christianity, and they called this new belief humanism. Historian David Robinson noted three key beliefs in John Dietrich's humanism. First, humanism declared human life is of supreme worth, an end to itself. In other words, life is not a means towards or away from salvation. Next, humanism upholds human inquiry and the scientific process. It rejects supernatural sources of wisdom, such as answered or unanswered prayers. And finally, humanism's goal is progress for the individual and society. In Dietrich's words, the aim of humanism is to unfold the personality towards, quote, the fullest enjoyment of the natural world and the human society. 10 years later, in 1927, Dietrich included his sermon, Unitarianism and Humanism, in a book published by the Humanist Fellowship, an organization that he founded with Curtis Reese in that same year. It would go on to become a center of publishing and organizing for humanist thought, including publishing the first humanist manifesto in the 1930s. In Unitarianism and Humanism, Dietrich wrote about the connection between the new humanist theology and William Ellery Channing's Christian theology. When I first learned of this, I puzzled over why Dietrich would draw parallels between Channing's vision of the soul communing with God and a set of beliefs centered on reason and human potential. And that's because where they differed greatly was in their sense of the ultimate. Dietrich defined humanism as faith in man, while Channing practiced theism, faith in God. The similarities between the two stem from the theological critiques of Christianity first named by Channing. Dietrich enumerated these in his sermon. First, Dietrich celebrated Channing's challenge of the Calvinist doctrine of, quote, human degradation. Channing viewed the human spirit as imbued by God with infinite worth and sanctity. He wrote in an 1835 essay against slavery, quote, We must look beneath the flesh to the spirit. The spiritual principle in man is what entitles him to our brotherly regard. For humanists, worthiness is a birthright of humanness, regardless of the presence or absence of God. However, humanists arrive at this belief by way of Channing's description of the individual. These are Channing's words. He is a person, not a being. He is an end, not a mere instrument or means. He was made for his own virtue and happiness, and not for the virtue and happiness of another. It is to degrade him from his rank in the universe, to make a human, make him a means and not an end. Dietrich carried forward Channing's criteria. He stated that the humanist position, quote, regards man as an end and not a means for carrying out the purposes of a superior being. He says, quote, for the humanist, quote, the supreme object of our allegiance is human life. Friends, our modern beliefs also rest firmly on the tradition of reason that both Channing and Dietrich used. Channing to interpret the Bible, and Dietrich to reconsider the supernatural aspects of Christianity. Dietrich lifted up this Unitarian legacy, describing it as a foundation of, quote, intellectual integrity rather than intellectual conformity, through the principle of, quote, spiritual freedom. For Dietrich, freedom and reason, and for Channing, freedom and reason are threads that we carry forward from our Unitarian ancestors to our contemporary lives as Unitarian Universalists. While I was puzzled at first at Dietrich drawing these parallels, as I studied their sermons, I realized that to claim itself as a religious community, both Unitarianism and humanism had to claim their relationships to what came before in order to distinguish the characteristics that made them unique. Channing distinguished Unitarianism from Calvinist Protestants. Dietrich distinguished humanists from Christian Unitarians. Each could not have existed without that which came before it. So let that bring us to today. Channing's version of Protestant Christianity, particularly the Unitarian strands of Christian thought and belief, are some of the roots of Dietrich's humanism. And our roots as Unitarian Universalists include the once new ideas of William Ellery Channing in the 1820s and beyond, and John Dietrich in the 1920s and beyond. These two Unitarians who promoted reason in our search for meaning-making. Channing, who challenged religious orthodoxies, creeds, and promoted a loving, not a punishing God. Dietrich raised a Christian who challenged notions of God and power with new humanist ideas. He argued that humanity was not the means of glorifying God, that humanity, we, were worthy of glory as an end to ourselves. Both of these thinkers planted roots that shape Unitarian Universalism today. Take, for example, the text of the first principle that we affirm and promote with every other Unitarian Universalist congregation in our association of congregations, the worth and dignity of all people. Not some people, all people. Not the worth and dignity bestowed by God, although some of us might carry out that principle because it is our personal belief that worth and dignity are God-giving. Our first principle is our first principle because we as a religion come from Christian Unitarians who saw first that worth and dignity God-given in all people, and that we as a religion come from humanists, and we believe that worth and dignity is a birthright in our humanity. And that's just one example. When we know where we come from, it helps us to carry forward the wonderful contributions of our ancestors. And when we know where we come from, it helps us to make up for mistakes of the past. I hope you will go forth from today's service knowing that we are responsible for the shortcomings of our ancestors' ideas about God and humanity. Channing, for example, affirmed in theology that all people of all colors, creeds, and kinds had the same souls, and he opposed slavery for moral reasons. Yet, in his political writing, he was a gradualist on the abolition of slavery in the United States, expressing skepticism that enslaved African people who were freed could navigate new freedom without instruction from white people. Similarly, Dietrich's conclusions about power and progress are found lacking through the lens of today's UU values. Dietrich challenged God as the ultimate power and purpose in our lives, proposing instead that, quote, the supreme object of our allegiance is human life. A reverence solely to human life leaves out a lot of life forms on our planet. Dietrich didn't have an ecological analysis. That idea hadn't found its roots yet. Nor did he have an understanding of collective liberation, because we can see now that a myopic focus on the goal of progress for the individual risks self-absorption and overconsumption. It can lose sight of the fact that progress for one or one group is too often the cause of misery for another. So let us reckon with our Unitarian ancestors. Let us reckon with their truths, their strengths, and what they missed. Because I hope you'll also go forth from today's service knowing that Channing and Dietrich are worthy of our admiration for their courage to speak their new ideas into the public sphere. They took ideas that they believed in and gave them wings. What courage! What courage in times of unrest and trouble. How did Channing and Dietrich find it? Channing in 1819, following the War of 1812 that raged on for 3 years, that ended in a stalemate after heavy casualties on both sides and naval warfare that led to the bombardment of cities up and down the coast. Dietrich in 1917, in the unfolding of the deadliest war, the one hopefully, naively proclaimed the war to end all wars. Friends, let's be honest, in this decade, we are in troubled times too. Perhaps more so as our annihilation is not just from pointing weapons at another people's people, but by filling our atmosphere with carbon, our water with contamination, and mining mountain tops. We need courage. We need it to survive, to endure, to thrive, to imagine, to act. How will we find our courage? I propose it comes from knowing our ancestors and imagining our future ancestors, our inheritors. And when we find our courage, how do we know when and where to be courageous? Perhaps we could be guided by a contemporary prison abolitionist, Mariam Kaba, who invites us to create the conditions in our here and now for future ancestors to thrive. For that thriving, where does courage call you? We each have ancestors that belong to our family, our religion, our nation, our humanity, our planet. Who are the ancestors that you know well? Who do you admire? Who do you reckon with? Who are the ones who aren't so well known but may have a story to tell you just the same? And who are the ones you imagine in the future? What you do with your each day, it matters to those ones. It matters. You matter. May it be so.